My friends, we're here at ancient Archaeology Creek in Gillespie County, and we're going to do some more exploration of this creek bed that was terraformed in ancient times, built in its entirety out of a magic concrete recipe that the ancients mixed and heated and laid down in a stepped fashion. So we're here on the northern bank of ancient Archaeology Creek. So above the primary layer, we see this softer jumbled material, earthquake mitigating, right? An earthquake mitigating layer composed of really small, chalky, soft layers. So there you go. You always see this. Always, always, always. Not just here in Texas, but around the world. When they build pyramids, when they build hills, when they build creek banks, river banks, they always use alternating hard and soft layers. So another soft layer, and then a hard layer. So that's pretty interesting. Let's look at the seams between ancient concrete. Oh, it's not right angle, it must be a crack. Really? Is that what it is? Not a Roman right angle job. Nothing's Roman right angle, right? But we do see section breaks reminiscent of a Roman right angle job. But notice that there's almost no section breaks in this primary foundational layer. The ones we did see were so close knit you could barely tell it was a seam, and then up here there's more section breaks, right? And then up here even more. And here in the creek bed, you don't really see any section lines. You just see one long molded concrete bed. Pretty incredible. Reminiscent of the Roman sectioning, reminiscent of Roman blocks. There's a straight line seam in that layer. Not a fracture, but a seam. You can see there's no breaking apart. As we move up the creek, we see these diagonal section lines, right? Section seams. Let's look for another one. Diagonal section line, section seam. So the ancients were building in diagonal sections. Again, we find another one, diagonal, right? Diagonal to the flow of the river, about a 45. Institutional geology will say, shut up, sit down, take the test. That's all they're going to say. And the test will be on the various names of minerals. Diagonal seam. So we have diagonal seam construction, right? As we move up, we see the regular seamage. Here's another one, diagonal seam. Diagonal to the flow of the river, as we see in Bosnia, as we see in the Blanco River. Here's another one, diagonal to the flow of the river. And in the layer 5 or 6 up, we see another diagonal seam. So we see how it's going diagonal to the flow of the river, about a 45. It's not just the layer above the creek bed itself, but the layers above that. Diagonal seam, 45 degree to the creek bed. Diagonal to the flow of the river. And we have this nice, smooth section face showing us that the ancients built in sections, right? Because we have this really knobby material. Really knobby, really knobby, really knobby, really knobby, and then smooth. Not perfectly smooth, not Grecian smoothness. The other side of the creek, and we see again a diagonal construction seam. And that seam, if you follow it across, is going to match a diagonal seam on the other side with another seam like this, which is about a 45 to the flow of the creek on the other side of the river. When I say matching, I don't mean it would necessarily be a perfect linear match. I'm saying it's going to be an angular match. It'll be the same angle as seams over here on this side of the creek, because that's what we've seen. So we just go with the evidence. Now, why institutional geology is not dealing with evidence, I don't know. Now, up above this primary bank of ancient Archaeology Creek is a continuation composed of regular depth ancient concrete layers. And let's look for seams in these layers. When I say look for seams, I don't mean that we're worried we won't find them. We will find them, because that's how the ancients built. So here's a diagonal seam right here. Another diagonal seam, and they're so closely knitted you can barely see them. Another diagonal seam right there. Right? We follow it. It's so closely knitted. It's unbelievable, really. The coloration helps us. But then we have one that's less closely knitted. We're going to start here, and we're just going to move right up the seam, okay? Now, if you want to call this a fracture, we're going to have to put you in a mental institution, okay? That's a seam that's joining together. All right? And it's diagonal to the flow of the river. Here's another one. Here's another seam that's joining together, joining, okay? So we have these, what look to be just sort of random, natural layers of concretized material. But in fact, this was concrete laid down intentionally by the ancients as part of this hill bordering ancient Archaeology Creek. It's astonishing. So we have again the seam that goes through many different, quote, eons of sedimentary material. That's the institutional professors talking. They're saying those are different eons, different time periods, and yet we have one straight line going through those different time periods. Oh, really? Wow, amazing. Here's another. Here's where the seam starts. At least where we can see it starting. That's one time period. Then we're going to another time period. So in the words of the institutional geologists, right? So two time periods with the same straight line seam. Amazing. It's almost as if someone came and laid this down like concrete, and it wasn't two time periods. It was all laid down in one day. Here's another seam, so closely knit you can't even see the start of it. But there's at the bottom, but in the middle it starts, and then you see it, we follow it up. Not a straight line Roman right angle job, but an ancient. We got things to do after we build this, after we terraform this planet. So that seam goes through all those different layers. This is comedy because this seam goes through so many different layers of what institutional geology calls sedimentary material. Impossible. And of course we find the smooth face. It's the interior of a section. Now, you want to call this a fracture? Institutional geology does. That's a fracture. That's a fracture. Thanks for the sunlight, son. That's a fracture. That's a fracture. It broke out here, it must be a fracture. Or is it a seam line that, because it's not flush here, it's not flush across, this is not protected by the strength of the material, right? And therefore we'd call this a broken piece from a seam. Okay, we're just going down section by section by section by section by section, okay? That's what we're doing. Here's a seam in ancient concrete, okay? And institutional geology will call this a fracture. Okay, does that look like a fracture to you? Fracture? Interesting. more seamage. The lines aren't perfectly parallel, right? That's okay. Ancients were busy, presumably. Here's an interior section face. We get to see that. We get to see the perfectly close-knitted seam where two sections joined. So presumably these two sections were cooling at about the same time to be able to join so perfectly. Perhaps. We don't know how they did it. They might have used sonic technology, which would have allowed them to do things we don't know about. Let's just move down and see if we can find another section. But notice how the material is integral, and then it's the only place we find any breaking is at a section line. A clear section line. Pretty amazing, right? Amazing that it's so strong that it's held this long. Looking for a section line. There's one. So, perfectly knitted section line. And it goes through all those eons of time. And these two have come apart a little bit. Okay, that's all right. Why have they come apart? Because they're not protected from that side. So we see this major layer not protected from the left. But as we go further to the right, there is protection. So there is enough protection for this to stay strong. So this seam is holding. And we see the perfect seam, not fracture, in this incredible material. This seam was there, and 3 feet to the right, a major seam, double seam, smooth interior faces. When I say smooth, they're not perfectly smooth. Okay, they're not perfectly smooth. But then we can get up here and see the quality of the building. On this side, the quality of the building, right? And if we think that this might be 100,000 years old or 1,000,000 years old, it's amazing that it survived the cold and heat differential, right? So every few feet we find another seam, but until we find the seam, we don't find fracturing. So the material stays strong. It's completely integral until we find a seam, and even then it's integral. Look how close knitted that is. I mean, it's so strong.